Some people call me a multidisciplinary artist or creator. I tend to think of myself more as a hack of all trades. I
Mhm.
do a lot of different things. Some of them I do well. Other things I just experiment with. But I'm always searching, always learning, always exploring, trying to just live in this crazy world and find meaning and hopefully create experiences for other people in which they can find meaning and get a bit of context in their lives. So
Yeah, wow.
that's kind of my background. I studied architecture at McGill University in
Hmm.
Montreal. After a very sports and non-arts background, I jumped full throttle into it, but I always had a hand in sciences because I wanted to connect things together, and I've kind of kept that multidisciplinary idea throughout my career, and that's what I teach to students now, aside from all the touring. I teach at the University of Toronto a class called the Architecture of Creativity. So I try to inspire people to be more creative because we'd be a better world if that were the case.
Yeah. Were you brought up with the arts or
Not so
not
much.
really?
My dad was from Austria, and he had a whole wealth of classical music in his background, but kind of was silenced by my older brothers who would only play rock and roll, and that's kind of what happened. And so I loved rock and roll, I still do, and I had that, but it wasn't, I would say, the arts. It wasn't something that was elevated beyond pop culture. So,
Hmm.
like a lot of people my kind of Gen X age, I grew up with television playing a huge role. But I would say the arts, in terms of going to theater, going to the ballet, going to the opera, were not at all a part of it. And even then, I think it's partly what informed the kind of art that I make, which is not highbrow. Even though I've worked with some pretty highbrow artists, the ones that I enjoy working with the most are the ones who have a real grounding in popular culture, in what makes people who hate theater want to come see theater. And often that is not trying to be purposefully weird. It's just trying to be authentic to who they are. And in my case, I got pop culture all through my DNA. So that's what I try to reflect in whatever I do. And sometimes it's serious, sometimes I just take the piss as well.
That's part of the creative whole aspect of just coming up with new and inventive ways to go about it, right?
Yeah, I think you have to continue to push yourself in some ways. I've been at this for a while, and I try to surprise myself. I think surprise is a big thing that I try to tell students, whether you're in acting or dance or whatever, in terms of what you experience. An audience loves to be surprised, right? TV
Yeah.
people and film people know that there's a certain thing that can happen that makes you go, wow. And I try to surprise myself with the projects that I take on, some of which end up as total, call them failures. They're never a failure in terms of was it worth it or not, but
Right.
they don't end up, making money or touring or being successful. But in terms of a process, yeah, it's about just constantly never being fully satisfied, even with the things that are successful. If anything, trying to make sure that what you see as successful is always changing too.
Kind of going back to the your first exposure to kind of the whole theatrical and acting experience was in university.
Yeah, I saw a few plays when I was younger, but they were mostly in high school, and I
Hmm.
wasn't in any of them. It was a French high school, so I was never 100% comfortable in French, and I wasn't the most expressive kid, which may surprise a lot of people now, given how much of a ham I am. But I really was quite shy. I was a very good student, very diligent about getting good marks. I was not the class clown or the artist, and I was not in the school play, and I was not captain of the football team. I was just very low key, probably somewhat of a geek, playing Dungeons and Dragons and all that stuff, right? And then plays started happening when I started doing musicals. And a lot of people come at theater through musicals because
Hmm.
they're pretty accessible and they're fun. You get to sing and dance about very sad things sometimes,
Yeah.
and it's a lot of fun. And so I did Grease, like a lot of people do. I played, Danny, and I was doing my best John Travolta imitations. It's cool, baby. So I just love doing it. And next thing you know, I'm like, wow, I'm in plays, I'm in musicals. And there's a whole crowd of people who love musicals. And wow, life is great when you're an artist. And I was doing Gilbert and Sullivan musicals. I was doing all sorts of stuff. But then Robert Lepage, big influence in my life, came to speak when I was at architecture school I was doing Gilbert and Sullivan. I remember I had my HMS Pinafore score, and this guy came and spoke about trying to be an interdisciplinary artist and not have any barriers imposed on by anyone. And already I felt I was having barriers imposed upon me, even though I'm a white man of privilege with a lot of possibilities. I already felt a bit caged in what I could do, and he opened it all up. I thought anything is possible, and so I sort of followed in his footsteps, and he became a mentor. And then I started making my own theater, which was a big step, making my own shows, thinking, would anyone want to see something I've made? And people did. And so I kept trying to just push and push and push. And so when I talk to young people today, I talk about not only having sort of a big picture perspective on a career, because, you know, in the scope of things, one big success or big failure is not a big deal in the scope of a big career, but also how to push yourself to validate your own creative voice and to think that it has meaning and that someone will find that interesting if it's done in a certain authentic way, and you might change someone's life. And if that's the case, if it can deepen the storytelling or help engage the audience or create something interesting, then I'm all for it. And it so happens that every play I've done, whether it's about religion or about The Simpsons, which is TV to begin with, or in the case of Bigger Than Jesus, this religion play, it was all about the image of the Son of God. So image had a lot to do with it, and specifically like multiple images. So I'd use the camera to create sort of multiple effects. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it worked really well in that case. It's always one of the tools you have, but it's not the only tool, and you only use it if it helps tell a story. And for that, you can't just be your own judge. Like, I'm doing solo shows and I'm directing. I need an outside eye. I need someone in the room to help tell me if it's cool to have the image behind me, and if it's meaningful in any kind of way.
With your shows, which is your main, like, I guess your outlet for all this expression and all this kind of meaning and this message that you want to bring across to people, your shows are very multimedia, right? So you have that dynamic between the images you're projecting or what you have, maybe a video in the background or something, and you've got that, and then you've also got your acting, your saying words, you're saying lines. So what do you think? Do you think that how do you kind of balance the two when you're putting together a show like that?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing working with media, and I was part of the earlier generation. I mean, people have been using video for 40 years, but it only became really popular in theater in the 90s when I started making my shows. And I was trying to be innovative with how I used it, and not just have a screen in the background and call it multimedia, which I see a lot these days, and it kind of bugs me. There's sort of like, wow, we need a video projector because we can save on sets. Let's just project a bunch of sets. Call it a multimedia play. I find when your play does not use media in an intelligent way, in other words, like, you have to question what it is about the theme of your play that might benefit from having a screen or a camera help tell it. And if that's the case, if it can deepen the storytelling or help engage the audience or create something interesting, then I'm all for it. And it so happens that every play I've done, whether it's about religion or about The Simpsons, which is TV to begin with, or in the case of Bigger Than Jesus, this religion play, it was all about the image of the Son of God. So image had a lot to do with it, and specifically like multiple images. So I'd use the camera to create sort of multiple effects. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it worked really well in that case. It's always one of the tools you have, but it's not the only tool, and you only use it if it helps tell a story. And for that, you can't just be your own judge. Like, I'm doing solo shows and I'm directing. I need an outside eye. I need someone in the room to help tell me if it's cool to have the image behind me, and if it's meaningful in any kind of way. So in Boone, which is the play I'm doing here, I have the screen in front of me. So there's always an image between me and the audience. So the audience is seeing me in the context of the image, which is very different from, you know, a TED Talk or whatever, where, like, today in the school I had the images behind me, so I'm constantly looking to see if I'm there. Whereas if I have it right in front of me, it's almost like I can move it and control it and manipulate it. So even though there's a barrier between me and the audience, I feel more immersed in media and creating something pretty interesting for people.
Are there any specific guidelines you always follow or rules you put in place, or do you kind of just go with the flow?
It's a good question. You know, where are sometimes the sparks? Sometimes when you're creating and writing, you're like, where do I start? You know, and often it's improvisation. So I'll find something I want to say, and I'll sort of get bored of my own voice, and so I, start to say, well, it sounds interesting if I do it in a voice like that. Or what if I'm really hardline, New York Jewish kind of character? What does that mean? Oh, if I speak with this kind of accent, right? What does it mean when you do these sort of things? You're like Homer Simpson or Marge. What does it mean to try something different? And often what that does is you're not going to end up there, but it takes you out of what you're trying to say, gives it a bit more of a context, and then you come back and say, this is what I want to say. This is how I want to say it. If I'm doing a play about the baby boom generation, God knows there's a lot of research. And how would I have done this without Wikipedia and YouTube in the past? I don't know, but it helped a lot to be able to soak in all of this content and then be able to pick and choose what is it I want to use. And in some ways it was kind of cool because the play Boom is about technology, because it went from, in that period, radio to TV to black and white TV to color TV, and that had a huge effect in the rebellion that happened in the late 60s, because images were coming into people's living rooms of horrific things like the Vietnam War. And so it led all these teenagers who were coming of age to rebel, because they were all connected by technology in a similar way that you're connected with your friends with your device. So there's something really cool about technology, and I wanted to use technology to be able to tell that story and show the evolution of it. So I created Boom by filming my rehearsals and then editing it on, in that case it was Final Cut, but I was basically editing myself, taking YouTube clips, putting it on top. I was layering and then going to my designers and saying, next workshop, we're going to do what I just did in this movie and do it in theater. So it was kind of like layers and layers of technology that would often happen in the room, but then totally immersed on the screen.
What's kind of the process you take in developing these really, really accurate representations of other people?
Imitations are, you need to have a good voice. You need to have a voice that can twist and contort in different places. To go in Boom from someone like Perry Como, who's like a crooner, like a Frank Sinatra, to a Janis Joplin, who's, crazy singer, sounds a lot like Axl Rose of Guns N' Roses. So I kind of have references sometimes. I go, okay, that's a lower larynx voice, higher larynx. Like I technically know what happens in the voice so much because I've trained it to go these places. But then there's the ear, like what you have to be able to listen to go, what is it that makes Martin Luther King's speeches ring so clearly? And often it's in the rhythms of his cadence. It's what an orator has, to be able to build and stop and then hold and volume and then pull back. These are all tools you have. So I needed to develop my ear, and often to record myself and go listen to the original and go, no, I'm way off. When it does, like when you know you want Janis Joplin to sound like that and it does, it's such a joy. Like it's really cool to be in that voice when it's happening, because then you feel really, very powerful. Part of the experience of it that I like when I see solo theater is kind of going, how could one person do that? That's part of the sell of it, is that why aren't there 12 people on stage? There could be, but watching one person play Peter, Paul, and Mary at the same time through just shadows is a pretty interesting experience that you don't get normally when you watch stuff on a screen. So to do that live in front of people takes people on a ride.
Yeah. So, what's the difference between just having to, obviously work with a team, but just having one actor on stage, and then having productions where maybe there's multiple people and then you have to listen to everyone's lines for cues? And how do you compare
in
that?
some ways it's pretty lonely doing a solo show when you're on the road, because cast parties are a little bit blah. On the good side, the audition process is super easy. I always get the job. I find it's nice to have other people to bounce energy off of on stage. Like it's great to do plays with other people. And I did a two-hander for a long time. I did the Canadian premiere of a play called Venus in Fur, which was this sort of really sexual thriller cat and mouse game that was a huge hit off Broadway. And we did it with this woman named Carly Street, who's one of Canada's strongest actors. She's based in Toronto. And it was great because she was on fire the whole play and I was just keeping up. And it was so much fun to not be the person whom all the comedy depends on, so
what it rides on.
Yeah, exactly. So I love, and these La Page plays that I talked about, like I'm just one out of 9 actors in a giant show where people forget about me, and that's a good place to be in as well when the other side of you is everything is on my shoulders. So I like it. I like the freedom. I like the control. I like the ability to take people on that ride, but I also like to disappear sometimes.
We should probably get into the show that you're presenting here, actually, at the school, which is Boom, a show about the baby boomer generation and kind of from the years 1946,
45,
to 1969.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your inspiration for the show and how you kind of came up with it?
A few inspirations, I think. I was born in 1970, conceived the week of the Apollo 11 moon landing. So there was a bit of a mini baby boom where people were like, whoa, we made it to the moon, let's make babies. I think that happened because prior to that, 1968, a lot of crap hit the fan. Martin Luther King got shot. Bobby Kennedy got shot. Prague was, you know, the U.S. was on fire in riots. Europe was uprising. It was a really difficult time for a lot of people. The sexual revolution, the hippie revolution, peace and love was descending into a drug-fueled chaos. It was really not a happy time. And the moon landing for a lot of people was a realization of, wow, maybe the world is not going to hell. Maybe we can accomplish things. And whatever you think about the moon landing, that's where I was born into. So I wanted to kind of retrace a bit of my parents' story and find out what's in my DNA. Like what experiences did they live that I can learn from? When you frame it in a different way, when you say, no, I want to archive your whole story. Tell me everything you remember. You get different stories, and that's what was coming at me. My dad was telling me these stories of how when he was in Vienna growing up through the war with bombs happening all through his childhood, he had a swastika in his classroom when he was in grade 2. And I didn't know that. I thought, wow, you were part of Hitler Youth. Like, oh my God. He said, well, everyone had to be at the time, and I didn't know that. So I thought, why don't I dig a little deeper here to contrast a little bit of the sort of typical baby boom story, which is, hello, honey, honey, I'm home kind of story, right? So
Yeah.
It was a good contrast, automatically, those two stories, and it made me dig further into my mother's life, into a lover that she had, who was a black guy, a draft dodger from the States. Like, whoa, man, why don't I know this stuff? And so all those stories ended up fueling, I think, giving heart to a larger story I wanted to tell, which was about the politics, the music, and the technology of that era, which were so influential. I think rock and roll had a big part of it. I've always wanted to sing rock, and this gave me a chance to, to put on wigs and sing like the Who.
Two birds, one stone. Right?
Exactly. Oh yeah, there's always a bunch of motivations going at it, but there's obviously a selfish side of it. It's like, I want to be able to sing the origins of rock and roll, like, but I don't want to create the show which is like Rick Miller sings the 60s, you know, and now Motown. Like, that's crap. I don't like that kind of show. What I like is the kind of thing I'm putting together, which is something unlike what a lot of people have seen, which is balancing personal stories into the politics and the rock and roll and the documentary, so it feels like something different. When you look back over your life, you'll kind of realize that in your first maybe 10 years, if you live in peace and prosperity, you don't really think about politics much. It's only later that you do. So baby boomers come to me and they say, you told my life. This was my life put together in 2 hours. How did you do that? And I said, well, part of it was because I didn't live it, and I was able to look at it from the outside. Now I'm writing the sequel to Boone, which is much harder. Like, I'm writing my sort of life experience and realizing that all this stuff was happening when I was reading Charlie Brown and Archie comics and, you know, lounging in my, you know, tanning, you know, with like silver foil and baby oil, because that's what people did, you know, trying to, meanwhile, like, the world is always on fire, like, stuff is always happening.
Yeah.
So I was interested in not just the happy and the jolly, but what fuels the artists that inspire me to write the kind of stuff. It's always about what's happening in the world. And I realized I didn't know anything of what was happening in the world. I want to talk about how the baby boom still influences us today and how we can learn from our mistakes, learn from our parents and our grandparents, in your case, who might still be alive, and they have great stories to tell, and they won't be around much longer. And if you have a chance to ask better questions, you'll get really cool stories that will probably reveal stuff about you that you might not know. And that's what happened to me.
So it's more than just like a history play or a history lesson in the show.
Yeah, history is part of it. I'm interested in history. Some people go, oh man, I wish there was less history, more music. And some people go, I wish there were more music, less history. I love the balance of it right now, and but it's not one thing. It's like a documentary, but you say documentary and some people go, I hate documentaries. So it's hard to describe. It really is one person, 25 years, 100 voices, trying to capture a generation.
I was watching some interviews of you
Mm-hmm.
a while back, and you mentioned that your favorite impression in Boone was Barry McGuire, right?
Yeah.
Is it still Barry
Yeah, I
McGuire?
think so.
Why is it?
Well, because Barry McGuire sings a song called The Eve of Destruction. A lot of people have been writing protest songs for years and years and years, but it never reached number one. In other words, everybody was listening to it. For me to be able to do that song and then right before the chorus, cut it off and start doing the Pillsbury Doughboy as an experience with the audience, a lot of the audience who know the song is going, what? why did he cut it off? And then to come back at the end of that particular segment and finish with the chorus, it's just very satisfying because I know I've still got the guitar, I've got the harmonica. Someone who knows me knows Rick's going to deliver on that, and that's what happens. So it's like a year, and I do 25 years, or about 4 minutes. That year is covered by that song, and it's a fun voice to do because those words are still very potent today. And I just think of a few. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? I mean, just I love that line,
Yeah.
like the hypocrisy of our world and the sort of the gun industry and the violence. And anyway, it's still there, but that song still resonates with me.
Conclusion to this whole thing, you've already talked about your message and what you kind of want to bring across with Boom, that it's more about telling a story, and it's also about reminding people that they can contribute to the world and that the world has shaped them. All this stuff that's happened beforehand, before you were even born. Is there anything you might want to say specifically to students or teenagers who might come and watch this show? Like, what is the real impact you hope to have on them?
It's a very good question. I sometimes talk about technology and how there's a similarity now into what our technology can do. I think the thing about the phones and the little computers we carry around with us is there's someone who was very, very popular in the 60s and 70s, a Canadian thinker named Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan talked a lot about media, and he was pretty prescient about a lot of the things that we talk about now. And he was really big for a while, and people still see him as a bit of a guru. But he said certain things about technology and the tools that we use. And one of them was that we become good at what our tools are good at. And the danger with that is that what are these tools good at? They're good at like super fast-paced connectivity. They're not good at going deep on anything. And so I think what teenagers can benefit from, without hearing it constantly from their parents, is just being aware of who controls the technology, what it wants you to do. There's also money and power tied to that, but also the dangers of it, and the fact that, as I mentioned live today, that they're designed for you to be addicted to them. So they're designed sometimes for you to go too far. You can use them as tools, but be aware of what they want you to do and set your own limits with it so that you continue to be able to think clearly, speak coherently, and live meaningfully and not be dictated by the tools. A lot of the dystopian stories you hear today are all about when technology overcomes us and all that. I think there will always be a human spirit. It's part of why the arts matter. We have to remind ourselves about the humanities and our own connections with people.
I'm also a little curious myself. You've already mentioned that you're making kind of a sequel to Boom. Do you have any other projects that you might want to talk about? What's next?
This year has a lot of premieres. We're premiering a new version of Jungle Book, which is a production that I'm not in, but I've directed and co-created with my partner Craig Francis, who's here with me as well. That production is like we did with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, trying to take a classic story, reimagine it for today in a very interesting theatrical way so that it can speak to environmental issues. Jungle Book talks a lot about colonialism and our dominant relationship to plants and the ecosystem and all of that, and to animals. So I think it's taking that's got a world premiere in Florida in June. Our parody show, Game of Clones, which is a parody of Star Wars and Game of Thrones. That's a silly show, but it's good fun, and that's premiering in Yellowknife in May. So, and then I'll be working in the fall on the premiere of Boom X, which is the Gen X show. So I've got a lot of projects beyond all the other stuff we're always doing, and if anyone's curious, you can go to rickmiller.ca, or our company's called Kidoons, KIDOONS.com. We got lots on the go. So when I'm bored, I would look at my website and I go, I got too many things on the go to be bored. So onwards.
Good. Well, yeah, that sounds great.
Thank you.
Thanks for
coming. Nice chatting with you. Thank you.
You too. Thank you very much.
Lean in towards this way a little bit.
Like this?
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Should we wait for Manti to come back, or?
We.
I'm just worried that.